Hello and welcome to another episode of The Verdict. I am SprayandPray1000 and today we are going to talk about The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Now, Tears of the Kingdom is the sequel to 2017's Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which in and of itself was a massive departure for the franchise. They added overworld, they added more difficulty to the game, they added a more survival-based scavenging for weapons and food and equipment and loot. So for the most part, if you're familiar with Breath of the Wild, which it's hard not to be considering it's one of the more popular games of the last decade, then you're probably going to be loosely familiar with Tears of the Kingdom, which, for better or for worse, more or less plays very similarly to Breath of the Wild. So without further ado, I guess we could just really kind of speedrun this, because for the most part, if you watched any amount of my playthrough of this game, you kind of already know how I feel. If you've ever heard anything I've said about Breath of the Wild, on either in the playthrough or on stream, it's pretty much the same exact thing. So, the big thing that I like about this game right off the bat is that Breath of the Wild immediately expands the overworld compared to the original game. So the original game takes place entirely in Hyrule. There's things like shrines to find and other places to go into. There's villages, there's places like Death Mountain and, the Zora's Domain and Gerudo Desert and places like that. But what Tears of the Kingdom does is it takes all that and it bumps it up to, I would say 11 pretty much. Now that they've made this game into a sequel, it takes place sometime after the first game, right? What they added though was the ability to go underground into the depths, which is an area underneath Hyrule that is effectively almost a one-to-one of the above ground Hyrule, as well as the sky. Now the sky is a little bit similar to the way they implemented it in Skyward Sword, with the sole exception that it's on the world map, right? There's no loading zones, right? The entire world is continuous, right? You don't have to, transition through a loading screen like you would in Skyward Sword, and, the different segments of the map aren't isolated from each other and things like that. So, the big thing is that now there's effectively 2.5 overworlds to explore, right? And Tears of the Kingdom takes a good amount of effort in making sure that you have a little bit of everything, right? The main story now involves various places in the sky and the depths, right? There's multiple angles at which they want you to enter the depths or go into the sky or things like that. So one of the big things is the open-endedness of it, right? While there are quests and while there are quest markers, a lot of times your ability to solve these things is going to be left entirely up to you and your ability to harness things in the environment or figure things out. And sometimes that can lead to there being multiple solutions. Sometimes, not always, there could be multiple solutions to some of the puzzles. So in the original Breath of the Wild, there were a couple of different abilities that Link could use. He had Magnesis, which allowed him to levitate and move metal objects. He had Cryonis, which allowed him to create blocks of ice. He had Stasis, which allowed him to freeze and, manipulate items in time, and then potentially hit them and adjust their exit velocity once they break out of being stuck in stasis. And then he had bombs, right? The typical. However, in this game, they unfortunately, and this is one of the things I'm not a huge fan of, they decided to not bring back any of those powers. Instead, bombs are now considered to be pickups in the overworld, right? So you would have bomb flowers, for example, or pickups in the overworld, similar to how they were in other Zelda games like Ocarina and Wind Waker. Usually before you get the bomb bag, they lock some of that behind, just some puzzles are locked behind picking up bombs and figuring out how to use them. In this game, you could pick up bombs without setting them off, and then they get added to your inventory like other items, right? Like I said, this game is very much a survival looter kind of game. You pick up items and you can use them later. Instead, Link has a bunch of new powers, largely involving this mysterious arm that gets attached to his arm that allows him to manipulate objects. So, for example, Magnesis is pretty much the only one that returns. It returns as an ability called Ultra Hand. Ultra Hand can be used on pretty much anything in the environment. It can be used on, for example, rocks. It could be used on tree trunks. It could be used on weapons. It could be used on devices such as, wheels and platforms and things of that nature. In addition to that, you are allowed to fuse some of these objects together. So, for example, you can make a rudimentary car. You can make a little plane. You can make various different things that will allow you to accomplish traversal or puzzle solving in the overworld. And this game, and this is one of my favorite parts of the game and one of the biggest positives I have about it, this game spares no expense to make use of that. It's actually very ingenious the way that some of these puzzles are designed. Like I said, because you're able to freely combine and mix and match different items, you're able to solve puzzles in a variety of different ways. Now, there are some other abilities that Link has acquired. He has acquired the ability to reverse time, called Rewind. It functions similarly to Stasis, but you can only reverse time, or you could stop the reversal at different periods in the reversal of time. So, for example, this game, rather impressively, keeps track of every object in the overworld. Every object that is loaded around you, this game is constantly keeping track of how, the direction it's moving, how it's moved in the last 20 or so seconds. And at any point, you could pull out Rewind and basically say, I want to rewind that object. And it will rewind that object and any other objects attached to it back to whatever position it was. I think up to like a maximum of 20 or 25 seconds, right? Insanely cool. There's a lot of cool things that you could do with that. The other abilities that Link has acquired are Fuse. Fuse is basically like your utility ability. Pretty much what Fuse does is it allows you to take a weapon or some other object that you have, like a weapon, a shield, and it allows you to combine it with an item on the ground or in the overworld. So, for example, Fuse would allow you to combine, like, let's say a basic sword with, like, a Bokoblin horn, which is something I use quite frequently, and that will increase its damage because the damages will additively stack up. So, for example, if the sword was only a 10 rank weapon, right, it has 10 damage, and the horn was like 30, you now have a 40 damage weapon, right? Very good, very helpful. Some of the best weapons in the game are unlocked using this, right? Additionally, he has auto build. Basically, auto build does exactly what the name suggests. Auto build allows you to create and manipulate objects. It will store, there's throughout the game, different characters and different machines will give you what's called schema stones. You could use auto build to build a variety of different items and objects that have already been assembled, so you don't have to manually assemble it each time. They let you save a bunch of different different schema yourself, like things you created, as well as it has like a pretty decently long history of things that you've built and manipulated. So a lot of times what you could do is you could solve a future puzzle just because something in your history will allow you to say, reach out to it or, create a platform where otherwise there are no materials, right? It's a cool feature. I do like it. It does save time. It definitely makes your life a lot easier. If parts for auto build cannot be found nearby, what Link can do is he could use what's called Zonite in order to facilitate it. Now, parts built from Zonite will break as soon as they are, as soon as anything else can be broken, because when you fuse objects, you could wiggle the stick and break them apart. So there is a little bit of a drawback to it, but Zonite becomes this very all-important, all-encompassing material, which is really nice. But beyond that, what is Zonite used for? Primarily, Zonite is used to increase your battery power. Now, as I said, this game has a much bigger focus on building. It has a much bigger focus on creating and manipulating objects in the environment. So one of the big things that you can do is that you can create things that run on battery energy, basically. Link will always have his battery attached to him. It's given to him at the start of the game. He's given one cell. And now what you do with that one cell is up to you. If you want to drive a car around, if you want to, use a machine, it'll take up energy slowly and deplete it until it's empty, and then whatever function is performing will stop. Now, I do like this power system. Later on, as you progress through the game, you're able to use Zonite to create more energy cells and create stronger energy cells, similarly to other games. Granted, it's not totally necessary. You could probably get through the game with a very bare minimum, which is probably maybe the one thing about the game I'm a little bit kind of on. Well, there's a lot of things, I guess, to be completely honest. But besides that, I do like that you're able to upgrade it. It is something interesting. I wish you could have maybe like really intricate contraptions. So for example, whenever you turn on the power on an object, which you basically do by just hitting it, like literally you just whack it with your weapon or your sword or a bow or an arrow or something, right? Whenever you hit something to turn it on, effectively you turn on everything attached to it all at once, right? Which unfortunately has the real drawback of making it so most objects are pretty much one function objects in this game. So for example, if you wanted to build like a real flying machine in this game, unless there's some very crazy contraption you're going to find and figure out, then you're pretty much just going to have a machine that does one thing. So for example, you can make, like I used, a bike that basically hovers. It just hovers up. You can't really like have a bike that also hovers forward. You switch between it as necessary. Do I need to go up? Do I need to go forward? Pretty much most devices in this game are one-track devices. Now that doesn't mean you can't make things that are cool or interesting or unique or funny, but it just means that you're not going to make like very intricate mobs that do a variety of different things. Beyond that, Zonite can also be exchanged to buy some things, which is fine. But Zonite is primarily found in what's called the depths. Now, as I said before, the overworld has basically been duplicated into the depths, and you can go down there. There's multiple places in the story where they force you to, or you could just explore down there yourself. What the depths are is basically a very dark, I mean dark, underground area that effectively just has nothing in it, right? What's down there, like no towns, no nothing. It's basically monsters and like ruins of a remnant civilization called the Zonai that used to mine out Zonite from deep beneath the earth. And what they used it for was to build their vast, great civilization. Now, obviously, it's fallen to ruin mostly. You'll find some enemies down there. The Yiga clan returns. There's a couple different plot lines. And without getting into the story yet, which I'm obviously going to be spoiler-free about, there's a lot of things to do down there, mostly hunting monsters, finding new materials. While you're in the depths, because the light of the sun and the light of Hyrule doesn't reach you, any damage you take will temporarily break your hearts. So what that means is every time you take a hit, whatever the damage of that hit was, it will effectively lock that heart from being able to be recovered from either eating or anything. Now, when you return to the surface, you get it back. You could also find what are called light roots. And light roots are basically big underground roots that come down from the shrines that are above ground. They've changed all the shrines around now because, you know, this game does a weird thing where it kind of acts like Breath of the Wild didn't happen for the most part. Sometimes, and that's something I'll get into with the story, but this game kind of tries to act like Breath of the Wild didn't happen. Like, characters go way out of their way to not mention things, which is very weird. But the shrines that are now on the overworld will have roots that stretch down into the underground. Now, this only counts shrines on the overworld. It does not count shrines in the sky. Shrines in the sky you just have to find, but you know, as you might suspect, it's not that difficult because it's very easy to fly up and see them for the most part. Some of them are locked behind certain quests and things like that, but for the most part, yeah. Beyond that, shrines in the overworld will have these light roots. You could find the light roots, as their name suggests. They will illuminate the ground. They will illuminate an area that's in the depths, so you could actually see. Because when I say it's pitch black, I don't mean like, oh, you know, it's whatever. I mean like you literally cannot see what's attacking most of the time. Like, you cannot see what's coming after you. It is pitch black down there. And remember, like, there's puddles of what's called gloom on the floor, right? Gloom does the same thing. If you're in it too long, it will start locking your hearts one by one. And obviously you don't want that to happen. So all of that leads to a very fun to traverse game world. It has a lot of stuff going for it. It's got a lot of really interesting and unique things about it. Now, the problem really begins with the fact that the worst parts of Breath of the Wild are still in this game. So at the start of the game, immediately there is a big outbreak of what's called gloom. Now, if you remember the last game, there was what was called Blight. Blight was basically the power of Calamity Ganon, and it was used to corrupt all the different guardians and things, which, again, are absent. No one even talks about it. No one even mentions any of them. It was used to corrupt all the different guardians that Hyruleans used to defend themselves, right? They made all this tech and everything. That whole plot line effectively has been erased from existence. It doesn't... there's references to it, but no one references the characters. No one even references, like, the sages that were commanding them, right? They're just all gone. And you might say, well, for a sequel, they don't have to spend a billion years telling you what happened in the first game. But I would argue that as a sequel, you know, it should build off of that. Like, they should reference it a little bit, especially since it was such a big event that led to the events of this game. It's almost like they really wanted this game to be standalone if you never played Breath of the Wild, because ultimately I will say that this game is easier, right? And it's not that easy is bad. I just think that they made this game so that if you didn't finish the first game, I guess you wouldn't be super spoiled on what happened in the first game. Because Breath of the Wild was a very difficult game. This game is also hard, but I mean, both games ultimately I don't think are really that hard. Like, once you get to a certain point, you're upgrading, etc., you kind of get beyond that. But basically, every weapon gets infected by what's called gloom. Basically, it rots the weapons and makes them really weak. This pretty much encompasses almost every single weapon in the game. Sole exceptions being some weapons you find in the depths. And some weapons just happen to luckily escape it. This also includes the Master Sword, which leads into yet another reused plotline from Breath of the Wild, where a good chunk of the game is spent trying to hunt down the Master Sword. Now, if you remember Breath of the Wild, it's entirely possible to beat that game without the Master Sword, without tons of things. In fact, that's what the speedrunners do, is that they will launch themselves to Hyrule Castle with the bare essentials needed to kill the 4 different bosses and beat the game, right? Now, obviously, they want this game to be at any point you could finish it. At least Breath of the Wild was that way. At any point, you could just say, I'm done, I'm ready to go fight the end of the game, right? Now, obviously, that would make the game harder. This game, with its story, is a lot more linear, right? So a lot of this game is going to be, there's different quests, right? Once again, you have to go help the 4 major tribes in Hyrule, the Rito, the Zora, the Gorons, and the Gerudo. You have to go help them and figure out, what's going on in their lands. And obviously, like I said, they recognize Link, they're aware that he's a known character. They don't really talk about the last game, they just reference that he helped them ambiguously. And then pretty much they did the one thing I really wanted them to do in Breath of the Wild, which was they added true blue dungeons to the game, right? Pretty much there's 5 or 6 different dungeons in the game that you can go through. Some of them are open world, meaning like they're in the overworld, which is nice. 2 of them are in the sky, which is cool because, it's really utilizing that new environment, right? You're not just stuck inside some cramped tomb, basically running around putting keys into things. I think that's one of the coolest things about it. Like, so the sky one involves flying and hovering and moving around in the air, which obviously Link can only use as paraglider, similar to the first game, which is cool. You have to make use of your helper, who is a Rito, to fly around and to manipulate things, and you have boss fights based off of that. And that's one thing I like about that. They do the same thing in the Fire Temple. Basically, every boss fight involves using your allies, because the characters from the first game will join you now in combat during their quest line. You have to use their power to beat the boss, which is inherently cool. Usually most Zelda bosses are, here's an item in the dungeon, you use that item in the dungeon to defeat the boss. It's very basic, it's very straightforward, and they ran with it for many, many, many years, right? That's actually one of the few things I'm not a huge fan of. And then at the end of the game, usually like in Twilight Princess, you have multi-stage boss fights with, the characters at the end of the game, where they require you to use all the different items you've used before. And it's cool, but I actually like that they're using things more with the environment, right? Preparing yourself by getting better weapons. I'm sorry, I'll close the window. It's pretty windy today. Preparing yourself by getting a variety of different weapons and items will help you. Getting food will help you, right? Because you can get food that buffs you and things like that. Finding weapons that have good durability, and fusing them with items will help you out. All good stuff. I feel like there's way more that goes into a boss fight in this game than just, well, I found the big key, let's fight the boss. And the dungeons are also more open-ended, which is also cool, right? You're not limited and forced to handle things in a certain manner. I actually do like that a lot. So, for example, as I said, in the Rito, in the Wind Temple, right, you have to figure out how to open up this one, these gears to free and stop the blizzard that's been terrorizing the Rito, right? So you could do it in any order, right? The dungeons do not require you to do one thing first, or one thing at this point, or one thing here. They just say, do this, come in, and whichever way you want to do it, that's fine. And I actually really like that. And you use your partners to handle that. Now, the thing I will say about the partner system, in order to use a partner's ability, you have to walk up to them physically and press A. That right there, probably one of the worst design decisions I think I've seen at all in this game. Now, granted, this is similar to my criticism of Final Fantasy VII Remake. The game isn't that hard. you don't always need your partners to help you in that manner. But what it means is that when you have 1 or 2 or 4 or 5 of them helping you in combat, combat quickly becomes a clusterfuck. Now, on one hand, it's nice because you have a bunch of people all hitting enemies and your teammates are actually pretty competent. They're not as aggressive as I'd like, but I guess if they were more aggressive, they would basically beat the game for you. So I like that your teammates will come and help you out, and I like that they have a very good story presence in this game compared to the last one. You know, it doesn't really feel like Link is fighting alone. Previously in Breath of the Wild, you gained a bunch of different button combinations. So for example, when you helped free the Goron champion, right, he would give you a shield ability, right? Well, that ability is back in the game. It's under the Zora champion now. You could use it both defensively, offensively, or to traverse hot environments, right? It gives you a shield of water around you, right? The Rito champion, once again, gives you the ability to fly. However, this time it's more horizontal than vertical. Whatever, that's fine, not a big deal. And, you know, so on and so forth. So that's one of the things I actually really like, is that, you know, we had abilities in the first game. Yeah, they removed them, but they added these champions that will help you fight in combat and things like that. I kind of wish that they didn't bind it to one thing. So, like, let's say you want to combo abilities, right? Let's say you want to kick the Goron champion to distract some enemies and knock them away, and then summon the the Gerudo champion to zap enemies with a bolt, right? Very hard to do. You have to physically run up to them in combat and then basically press A, aim, fire, and then, you know, go to the other one. It's way sluggish. It's almost not even really that usable in combat. So my biggest complaint is that this L wheel that they have, which is where they put the hand powers, right? They use different buttons for things that don't really make sense. So for example, you have an amiibo button, and I'm fine with the amiibo button. Why couldn't the amiibo button just be something on the pause menu, right? Like, why does it have to be something? Because it pauses the game anyway. Why couldn't it be something in the inventory menu, right? Why can't the camera just be an extension of the scope? Why do you need to have 2 buttons to zoom in? Now it becomes very cumbersome. Do I want to use the scope or the camera? Why not just combine the telescope and the camera together, right? You click it, and then there's just a button that says click. You just take a picture. Because taking pictures is important, because you use it for the Sheikah sensor, which allows you to find objects hidden around the map. If you take pictures of it, you could track it, things like that, right? And then lastly, they put the map button on the radial wheel. Why? The map is on minus. Why would they need a special button on the radial wheel for that? It just makes no sense ultimately. I think they wanted to have an 8-section radial wheel. I don't know why they didn't have 4 of those sections. Or first of all, why did they need to have 8 sections only? I think we can handle a little more than that. I know it's for the directions of the stick, but, you know, it's an analog stick, right? Like, you could have 10 sections, right? I think 10 maximum would have been good. You could have had all the powers come back, and you could have had your champions on it, so that way you can command your champions. That said, I think that Ultra Hand and auto build could just be a button you push in Ultra Hand. It pauses the game anyway. It doesn't need to be a separate ability. So that's one of my first big criticisms of this game, is that the way you handle ability, the way they bound abilities and equip them and attach them all over the place, it doesn't really make much sense. It's very cumbersome. And also just like things like commanding your champions in battle could be better handled with maybe like a button to give commands to them or to tell them to activate their abilities. So unfortunately, that's one of the big things I don't like about that. Let's get into some of the other ones. Durability, like I said, all the weapons are gloom infected. Awful, terrible. I don't know why they keep bringing this back. They keep thinking that the durability is like some clutch, amazing, fun gameplay element. Now, granted, the Master Sword, which is obviously an important sword in Zelda story and Zelda gameplay, can barely even kill silver enemies in this game. So the way the Master Sword works is that, unlike normal weapons, which will just shatter into a billion pieces the minute their durability hits 0, the Master Sword will just simply be unequipped from Link's hand and will go on a 10-minute cooldown. Now, you can't speed this 10-minute cooldown up. You actually can't even upgrade the Master Sword in this game like the last game. You just have the Master Sword as this disposable 30 power weapon. They just don't even tell you it's 30 power. It ups itself to 60 power in the presence of gloom enemies. So, like, if you're in the depths, basically, anytime a non-bug, because there's a couple bugs in the depths that run around, they drop, like, you know, seeds you could throw to make light in the depths. Anytime you do that, the Master Sword will go up to 60 power. The game does not tell you this. It's just something you need to know or you need to look up. And while that's good, obviously you want to use the Master Sword to plunge and, you know, go through the depths, right? Like, the game's combat ends up being... It kind of works in the opposite. Instead of making combat very frantic and very scrambled, I almost want to avoid combat as much as possible, because the minute I start fighting high-level enemies, I'm basically guaranteed to lose a weapon, and there's nothing I could do about it. You can't say, take the weapons of fallen enemies and then fuse it into your weapon to keep the durability high, right? Which would lead to a strategy where you could disarm enemies using a taser, or using a lightning rod, I call it a taser, and then using their weapons to, you know, fix up your weapons, right? There's no strategy in it. It's just, hey, if you run up and use your weapon, it's going to break, including the Master Sword. So, like, this great blade of legend is only really good in the final boss fight. The other reason you would use it is because it's a renewable weapon you literally cannot get rid of. So the weapon durability system is still just as bad as it was. In fact, it might even be worse, because you can't, like, get into high-level areas, run around, pick up some weapons, and then go back and do whatever you were doing, you know, just, like, do a death run to try to get loot and then leave. Yeah, not a fan of that. I said this before, the durability system was not good in Breath of the Wild, and it's the number one thing I hate about this game that is still in there, right? Secondarily would be the way that they handled the abilities, like removing stasis. Why would you remove stasis? That was one of the coolest abilities, was the ability to, like, launch projectiles, stop enemies, get some free hits, right? Things like that. Now, a lot of enemies, like, for example, Lynels, are more annoying to deal with, because you can't stop them when they're at their, you know, when they stop or whatever, and get them a couple hits or whatever. You can't do that anymore. Now, granted, Lynels can be chain stunned with arrows, but I digress. You know, that's besides the point. So the abilities being removed is another big thing, right? Bombs, I could kind of understand why they would remove it, right? They want you to focus on this whole fuse mechanic, and to that end, they've also removed other arrows. So, for example, they removed the lightning arrows, the ice arrows, and the fire arrows. Now, in order to, you know, get the same effect, you have to fuse a fire fruit, an ice fruit, or a shock fruit, right? Again, do I think they should have removed all the arrow types? No. Do I think they should have maybe made them rarer? Sure. And I think that what you should do is you should be able to pre-craft them or something, so that way you could just pull it out when you need it. Because the other thing is that the way you combine items in this game, you can only combine them in gameplay, right? You can't, like, go into the menu, craft 10 shock arrows, and then go back to gameplay, right? You have to manually pull out your bow, notch the arrow, then press up on the D-pad, toggle over to the shock fruit, and then equip it on the arrow. And you must do this for every single arrow you want to fire in this way. Whatever you want to attach to it, you must do it every single time. And it makes it very tedious and very slow and not really worth it. And, I mean, like, it'll be worth it if it's necessary for you to kill an enemy or to get an advantage in combat. But, you know, it just ends up being very tedious, whereas I could have just made 100 shock arrows, been good to go, and then just shocked people as necessary, and just maybe had, like, a button, you know, like a press up to toggle arrows, right? Like, switch, okay, I don't want to fire, I want ice now, right? You're never really going to get that good combo. I think that if they could change that, that would be a much better system in general. Again, it was done to really promote fuse, which is whatever. Now, on the other hand, one of the things I don't like, the combat is just as basic as it was in Breath of the Wild. You hit with Y, right? Link can still not attack without a weapon. And this time he doesn't have bombs, mind you. So effectively, with no weapons, you are completely defenseless. There's almost nothing that you could do to fight enemies. Link cannot even punch, right? On the flip side, we have, like I said, at the end of the game, you have all these allies to come fight, and they will basically kill enemies for you, which is, again, the game is so stacked in the late game. But anyway, one of the big things I would say about it, though, is that, well, it is easier to get the Master Sword in this game, and it involves a little bit of overworld traversal, and obviously early in the game you don't exactly have a ton of resources. So, for example, you need to go into hot areas, cold areas, which is another thing I want to say about this game, is the way they handle temperature, unchanged from the first game. So the combat is very bland, basic. You know, there's only 3 types of weapons. You have one-handed swords, like the Master Sword and other one-handed weapons. You have spears, like the Zora Spear and other, you know, different weapons. And then you have two-handed weapons, like clubs and mostly heavy swords. That's it. There's no other weapon styles. There's no unlock tree. You know, most games will have like an unlock tree. Like, for example, Darksiders will let you unlock different moves to use as war, depending on different stick inputs and things like that. None of that exists in this game. There's no roll in this game. You can side hop, you can dodge, because there is a jump button, which is different for a Zelda game. There are a couple moves you could do with like dashing into jumping and things like that, but it's all very basic, and it's almost all entirely reused from the previous game. The main emphasis of this game was on the creativity aspect, and the combat aspect was literally unchanged almost from the first game. Now, when you remember that they took away things like Cryonis, or, you know, bombs and things like that, you end up having fewer options a lot of the time, unless you're intentionally rolling out with a tank or something that's going to, like, drive into enemies with spiked, you know, bumpers or something, which you're not going to do most of the time. It's either going to be too expensive to use Zonite-wise, because remember, Zonite is used to upgrade your batteries, or you're just going to be too early in the game or not have those materials around you. So while it is cool that you could create all these crazy things, they're not necessary most of the time. Most of the boss fights, in my opinion, are just more fun to play up front, and then it's not required for the final battle or the end game, really. So why would you want to use that? It's more like a curiosity, creativity thing than it is actually reasonable or feasible in combat. Now, the other thing this game does, and I've complained about this is one of my least favorite systems in Breath of the Wild, the armor system. In this game, this is not like normal Zelda games. In normal Zelda games, the amount of damage you used to take is determined by the enemy, right? It's determined by the enemy. You know, whatever attack they're using has a certain amount of hearts it is set to take. That's it. You can't really stop it unless you use magic armor in some games that allow it. In Breath of the Wild, the damage an enemy deals to you is determined by 3 different things. It's determined by the armor Link is wearing. It is determined by the weapon the enemy is using, and then lastly, it is determined by literally the type of enemy swinging at you. So, for example, a red Bokoblin trying to hit an in-game Link with a level 2 stick, right? A 2 damage stick is going to do the bare minimum of a quarter heart. That is the smallest amount of damage the game will allow you to take. You cannot immunize yourself to all forms of physical or magic damage in any way. You're going to take at least 1/4 damage, 1/4 of a heart. Now, at most, you could get 1 shot in this game. Now, even end game, you could probably get 1 shot, even with all the heart containers you could stomach, which I think in this game is something like 28 or something like that. It's a lot. You can get a lot of hearts. It's probably more than 28. I forget how many it is. Yeah. So, the biggest thing is that your defense stat is crucial in this game. Now, like Breath of the Wild, most, if not all of the armor sets return from Breath of the Wild into Tears of the Kingdom. You lose them, obviously you have to find them. You know, the game starts off, you have stuff, and then you lose stuff, and you spend the game getting it back. You have to re-upgrade it if you upgraded it before, or whatever. That's a sequel, I guess. It would be too easy if you just imported your save data, and were given basically endgame gear, like, hour 1, if you know where to find it. But what I don't like is, again, upgrading is such a grind. Like, some of the 4-star upgrades are like 60, or, you know, insane amounts of resources. And like I said, the game doesn't really require you to do it. I mean, so, like, that also, while at the same time you could say, well, it doesn't matter then, it's also like, well, then why would it be so high if it doesn't matter, right? Even at the end of the game, you know, the final boss is only taking like a half a heart, a full heart when I'm fully stacked on defense. I think that if they had smoothed it out more, added more difficulty, it would feel more rewarding, right? The grind to find 60 different veins of ore and then have a random chance for the ore I need to pop is not really that fun. It's not. I'm just going to be honest with you. Some of this you'll get just by exploring. Some of it you'll just be unlucky and have to grind for. And remember, when you go into certain areas, you have to upgrade temperature gear, right? And temperature gear, usually you just wear it because it's cold or because, you know, it's hot or whatever. And so you have to upgrade the defense, because otherwise enemies are just going to slap the HP off of you because your defense is going to be like 8 and you're fighting really high level bosses. So it feels like the difficulty of this game is nullified by how much you want to spend playing the game, which normally would work out if playing the game for the most part wasn't such a slow slog of breaking weapons, finding new resources, things like that. So at the peak of the gameplay tower, you have, you know, the shrines are cool, the overworld's fun to interact with, the quests are interesting, the story is fun, you know, traversing the overworld can be cool, the depths is that's part of it, the depths in the overworld are cool, right? Things like that. You could build interesting contraptions that allow you to fly to different places and things like that. On the bottom, you have pretty much the Breath of the Wild list. Low durability, they removed some of the different powers from Breath of the Wild. The armor system is still just as unfun and just tedious, right? You're swapping armor sets just to use it for 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds, and then swapping entire sets back. You know, a lot of the armor sets, in my opinion, could have just been like upgrades on a tree, and I think that's ultimately what they could have done with this game, is make it more of an RPG, right? Give Link the ability to deal damage, right? They could have added unarmed weapons, right? They could have made it so like maybe you could get different Master Swords like weapons, you know, like the Iron Knuckle or something. And that way you're able to at least attack when you have no weapons if you don't want to waste it. I'm not saying it needs to be a 100 power weapon. Just give me a little something if I don't want to waste my weapons, right? So you can run around and at least do something, you know? Add the ability, like certain upgrades, like anti-slip, right? Because there's a set that prevents you from slipping when you climb if it's wet. Why not have that be an upgrade? Like it's a glove upgrade, right? That you could get. And yes, even if Link is not wearing a glove, it's just an upgrade to make it, you know, to improve the gameplay, right? It gives you something to work towards, right? And like, I'm not saying cut these armor sets out the game. Maybe make them cosmetic. Maybe make it something, you know, you could dye it, you could glamour him, you could change how Link looks, right? It's not a multiplayer game, so you don't need to worry about like glamoring and then people are looking at you thinking you're wearing one thing and you're not wearing the other and you're wearing something else, right? So that's what I would say. I would say give him different abilities, like the ability, like there's another suit that lets you manipulate and move around in the air a little bit faster. Why not make that an upgrade? Why is that a suit? You're going to wear it for 5 seconds until you hit the ground, right? Like, why are you going to, you know, it's something that would rear its head in combat or gameplay only for a few minutes, or maybe a few, like maybe across your entire playthrough, maybe like 10 minutes of falling straight down, depending how long you play the game. And then you're just not going to use the power again, right? So that's what I'm saying. Things like that, right? Like certain suits and equipment in this game doesn't add anything. It doesn't do anything. Now, a lot of the Amiibo awards are in this game. You could just find them. I'm pretty sure all of them are. They're just different outfits Link has worn over the years. In the depths, there's a couple statues you could buy different items from, which is cool. And a lot of them will sell those items to you for Poes, because Poes in this game are currency. They're not enemies. You just find them in the depths and you pick them up and you could trade them to these statues for items and objects and things like that. That's a cool system, right? If you don't have Amiibo, everything's unlocked via story. Like I said, I've only used Amiibo like once, and even then, like, it wasn't very helpful. And even then, I don't know why it's on the radio wheel and not the pause menu. You see it there the whole game, and it's like you never use it. I guarantee most people playing it will never touch that option. An option to command your teammates would be much more useful. So ultimately, and I'm not done, actually. Let me take that back. Like I said, the temperature thing and the defense thing kind of work at odds. Why not have different things that you could do? You could say, okay, here's what Link looks like. This is my glamour set. Here is my defense, right? My chainmail or whatever I have underneath. Let's separate those stats, right? Let's say that you have armor on one hand, you could change Link's appearance, and then the temperature stuff is over there, right? So that way, when you're in a certain environment, you don't have to say, well, I would go do this, but I only have like 6 in heat defense, and I don't want to, you know, burn to death in Death Mountain or whatever, because I didn't go out of my way to buy a bunch of equipment. Now, they do handle it better in this game. In Breath of the Wild, Death Mountain is one of the worst areas in the game, because the entire area is superheated. In this game, Death Mountain is cooled off, which means that the overworld is actually really traversable there. Only in certain caves in the depths nearby are there, like, flame areas, right? And you also only need one piece to really walk around in it. Now, that said, again, system is still there. It's just been scaled back a lot compared to Breath of the Wild, which again leads me to believe that they probably didn't think most people were going to beat Breath of the Wild before playing this game. So that's why they kind of almost don't even spoil it. They barely even reference anything that happened in it. This game could have almost been an alternate take, and it would have made no difference almost. Now, the other thing I do want to criticize is the game's performance. Unlike Pokemon, this game runs well pretty decently. Sometimes when there's a lot of effects, especially in the depths where there's a lot of pollen flying around and glowing things and light and all that stuff and enemies flying around and fire effects if you're doing certain things, the game will chug. When the game performs pretty decently, right? It's not like Pokemon, like I said, where it's all the time. Sometimes the game will chug a little bit. Now, granted, it does run pretty well, but Xenoblade, I think, holds the crown in this regard for the Switch. And I know that the Switch at this point is pretty old. I'm just merely pointing that out, okay? It could run a little better. And, but everything else in the game, you know, it's fine for that, right? Like, there's nothing, like, really taxing about it. It's only a couple key spots where it kind of slows down and chugs a bit. Besides that, I guess we'll get into the story. Like I said, you know, all these different tribes are having these problems because Ganondorf has now returned. How this ties into Calamity Ganon is a little bit left ambiguous. I kind of speculated a little bit on the playthrough. For your sake, I will not go into it, right? You know, I don't want to spoil too much, but basically Ganondorf has returned and Link is saved by getting this arm. Zelda goes missing, and it's your job to figure out what's happened to Zelda, how we can help these tribes, and how we can ultimately defeat Ganondorf. That's pretty much the key of the game, the core of the game. I'm hitting on some of the key points. Like I said, there's temples that you go to. You find different people from the previous game who are still around, who are willing to help you and chat with you. And this time, a lot of them who are, you know, mostly side characters in the first game are now major characters in this game, which is cool. It's cool to have them, you know, talk to you and say things like that. Unfortunately, because of the non-linearity of the game, it's weird to have a game that's so non-linear, but the story is so linear. Because, like, let's say I did the Gerudo first, right? I just happened upon it. I was like, whatever, we'll just do it now. I did the Gerudo first. Basically, every cutscene that you get after you beat the temple is effectively the same thing with minor instances of story and a few things changed. So once you've seen one, you've effectively seen them all. The story doesn't really progress until after you've done all 4 of the regional events. Then you really kind of get back to the main story. Now, that's not to say that the story of each region isn't cool, but it doesn't progress the overall story of what happened, you know, what was Zelda doing, you know, in the past and all this other stuff. It doesn't really help that. It doesn't really progress it forward. Until you actually progress and do things. Now, granted, you can do things out of order. Like I said, you could entirely accomplish portions of the game way in advance, right? So, for example, there's a late game story event that I did pretty early. Before I even started to do a lot of these other things, I did it very early. You could find the Master Sword before you even do anything else, which is cool. It's nice to not be gated. It's just interesting and weird at points that a lot of it just seems like it's very 2-step, 3-step, 4 steps, and then the story is really done. Also, if you do things out of order and Link discovers certain things that have happened, he doesn't really tell most characters until the story prompts you to go do that thing. So there's it's not like as open-ended as like a Mass Effect game or something, right? Where like you could do something like, for example, Mass Effect, you could find Rex's armor long before Rex even tells you about it. And then you just give it to him. You're just like, I found this. Is this yours? And then, like, you've done it way in advance before he's even prompted it. This would be the equivalent in Tears of the Kingdom. The way they do it in Tears is that you would find his armor, and you would have to wait half the game for him to mention it, and then you would pull it out and be like, yo, is this your armor? But this time around, it's with major story events. It's like you can figure out the mystery of what happened to Zelda, and Link will just not tell anyone. It doesn't change any dialogue until the moment that the game is like, okay, well, you need to get the Master Sword, you need to find Zelda, you need to do this, right? Then and only then will the game allow Link to speak up and say, actually, I did this already. Now, like I said, Link is not voiced. I have no problems with that. Link has always traditionally not been voiced outside of grunting and, you know, yells and things like that. all your dialogue choices are through text boxes. Now, I'm totally fine with that. I don't want to say that this game needed a speech system, right, for you to, like, persuade people or whatever. Like, I'm not saying this needs to be Elder Scrolls. I would like it to be an RPG. I would not like it to be Elder Scrolls, okay? I'd like it so that you can gain levels, like, let's say, like I said, maybe you get the Master Sword early. Maybe you start with, like, a very low basic form of it, and you spend the game leveling it up. So when you find shrines and you complete them, similar to the first game, you get the blessings. This time it's from the blessings of Rauru, who is a major character in this game. When you find his blessing, right, it doesn't just eventually give you an extra heart or a stamina wheel piece. It also gives you something to improve the Master Sword. Maybe every couple of shrines you do, right, there's 100 and something in the overworld. It's still 120, same as last time, right? Like, every time you do a shrine, every 4 shrines you do, you get a piece of heart. Maybe every 4 shrines you do, you get a little bit of damage bonus on the Master Sword, right? You get 1 point to put into Link's stats. More strength, so he deals more damage, right? Because the problem is that red and blue enemies are basically one-shots at the end of the game. Black enemies are pretty easy. It's the silver enemies that are so obnoxious to kill. And Lionels in general are just obnoxious. They take multiple minutes to kill. Even flawlessly, killing a Lionel is a very major time commitment and weapon commitment, because you're going to lose weapons doing it because they have that much health. So maybe that would have helped you get around some of the, late game. Like, I was just tired late game. I just didn't want to kill any of these things anymore. It's just very tiresome to try and kill them, because it's going to be like a 10-minute engagement no matter how you slice it. I think that, yes, would it make Link stupidly overpowered? Yes. But would it reward people who go out of their way to do all these things, find all the shrines, find all the stuff? Yes. And I think that you should be rewarded for that, and I think that is a good idea. Now, they did overhaul the Korok system. Koroks are back. There's 1,000 this time. Finding them does the same thing as before. You can up your inventory space. You actually find Hestu very early in the game. And you can talk with him. He does the same thing that he did before. This time there's a more centralized area called Lookout Landing, where there's stores, there's a cooking pot, places to rest, things like that. As I said, because this is a sequel, all the people have kind of come together. They're not just trying to survive, like in Breath of the Wild, where the Guardians were just roaming all over Hyrule and stuff like that. It is a little bit of a shame that none of that comes back, even like just as like a throwback boss fight. But it is what it is. So Hestu is initially there, and then he moves later to the Great Deku Tree, which is its own plot line in and of itself. Now, the Koroks are basically the same as they were before. The only reason that they're pretty much in the game is because the Great Deku Tree gives you advice to find the Master Sword. Otherwise, they serve the same purpose. Unfortunately, the Koroks, the Kokiri, just don't show up in either of these games as meaningful presences. They're just there either for equipment or storage upgrading, etc. Like before, you find Korok seeds, you use it to upgrade your equipment. You're definitely going to have to do it unless you want to carry like 4 weapons the entire game and like 2 bows. Now, the Master Sword is given to you in a free slot, but needless to say, you probably want to get a good amount of other weapons as well. Beyond that, let's see. I do think that the upgrading in this game and the powering and finding the fairies and things like that was better, right? There's certain things that were from Breath of the Wild that have been made way better or scaled back heavily, like I said, with the lava or the different temperatures. It's a lot easier to find clothes, right? Some of them are very expensive, right? And for some reason, and someone needs to tell me, why the fuck do they put sneak in this game? Sneak to me is just like, it's cool maybe to, grab something, but you're not going to do like Metal Gear Solid style sneaking or Elder Scrolls style sneaking. It just feels so half-baked. You can't quietly climb up cliffs in this game, which is like the whole point. You would think you would do a cliffside ambush or something, right? And like, I don't know why they don't let you do any of that. Like when you climb, you immediately make noise. They do the same thing in fucking Legends Arceus. I don't know what it is at Nintendo. They haven't figured that out. Daggerfall did this, but to be fair, the other Elder Scrolls games don't afterwards. So, I mean, it's hit or miss, I guess. Sneak I just never really used. I never really liked it. I'm not saying a Zelda game cannot have stealth. There's a couple like stealth. Usually stealth is easy. Let's be fair here. You follow someone. It's the most basic form of stealth you would see in a video game. Yeah, I didn't like that at all. Now, the last thing, and I forgot to mention this, the best power that they implement in the game is a power called Ascend. What Ascend does is if a ceiling is a certain area near you, you are able to jump up into the ceiling and literally no-clip your way up through the ceiling until you reach the top of whatever it is. This, by far, is the most interesting power I think I've seen in a Zelda game in some time. What it effectively allows you to do is that you're never trapped downward as long as there's a ceiling above you. And yes, created objects and things like that will allow you to no-clip through them. So if you make a platform, that's actually something they use for a few puzzles, is you can make a platform and effectively jump yourself up. It's an automatic jump that Link will perform as soon as, you know, the marker says you can make the jump, right? Ascend is the best power in the game. It is used so well for so many different either trials or boss fights or even enemy engagements for you to manipulate and move around the environment. I love Ascend. It is a wonderful, it is a very well done, well thought out power for Link to be able to do it. And yes, you could kind of even squeeze through like thin places that are thinner than Link and stuff like that. It's very interesting what you could do. You could always exit caves and go back to the overworld. It's used in different powers. It's used in different shrines. It's used in all kinds of things. I love Ascend. It's very good. So I like the abilities because they basically allow you to come up with super creative, super different gameplay elements. The only ability that kind of comes close to that is a Link Between Worlds, where you can merge yourself into wall paintings, or into the walls, which is good for like boss fights and stuff. The skies and the depths add a lot to the game. I do like that. But ultimately, I think that while they did take a step in the right direction, it should be more of a Zelda game. I think that they should have more things, like I said, stats, because enemies get stats. A black Bokoblin will do way more damage than a red and blue to you, regardless of whatever weapon he's wielding, right? Like, or a silver will just take way too long to fucking kill. That is another one of the big things. So, if I had to wrap it all up, right, the durability system still sucks. They really make ineffective use of commanding your champions in combat. The menus have a lot of cumbersomeness to them, whether it's flipping through to find the right object to attach to an arrow or a weapon or to throw or to drop. Throwing itself is kind of cumbersome. The temperature system is back in the same ways. It's a little rescinded, but it's still not that great. Performance sometimes is an issue. The armor system isn't exactly great. But on the flip side, the game is still very fun. There's a lot to do and a lot to enjoy. So what would I give Tears of the Kingdom ultimately? Well, unfortunately, unlike Breath of the Wild, which was kind of very genre-breaking and genre-redefining, I'm going to give Tears an 87. It's good, but a lot of the really interesting, well-polished, and good portions are completely negated, or just on the other end of the fulcrum, you have, or, on the other end of the fulcrum, and, on the annoying kid at the end of the seesaw is all those other things: the durability, the armor system, the no upgrades, the no leveling up, the Master Sword is not great, right? All these other things just kind of lend to the game being not very fun. Now, I like exploring big open world games and doing quests and stuff like that, but like, there has to be some big reward for this. And that's one thing I liked about, say, Assassin's Creed Odyssey or Ghost of Tsushima, is that I never felt like the game was wasting my time. I felt like the game was giving me new weapons that I could use to upgrade things, right? Every time you level up, you gain a point. You could use that point to unlock a new ability. There's a whole ability chart that you could go down and add new moves, new abilities. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom have none of that. You have very basic methods of attacking. I like the creativity with the weapons and the ability to make mechs or whatever, but it's very expensive to use, very cost prohibitive. You're not going to use it that often, right? I do like the ability that you can, like I said, merge and get different weapons that do a lot of damage, but then they break and you can't fix them. So it's like, why am I going to use it if, I might need it for later, right? But all that said, ultimately the game is designed to be way easier than the predecessor, so like a lot of this is not even worth doing unless you just really like to do completionist level stuff. So like I said, in 87, it's a very good game. I had a lot of fun with it. Would I give it a 10? Of course not. This game is not even close to a 10. There's games I played that are way better that are closer to a 10. Could the story have been better? Maybe a bit. I like this incarnation of Ganondorf. I think the story is not the problem. I think this time it's the gameplay. right? It feels like such a disjointed sequel with so many things that just either don't mesh well with controls or with how you use them, that ultimately I wasn't very much a big fan of some of them. But I still like the overworld. I got a good 100 hours out of it, and I thoroughly enjoyed different parts of it, just thoroughly hated other parts of it. So, with that said, it's quality. You're going to get a lot of bang for your buck. It's well done. Some of the puzzles are interesting, but that's all I have for you all today, and I will see you all on the next episode of The Verdict. Thank you all, and yeah, have a good one.